Well, good afternoon, everybody. After a slightly slow start, here we are. Apologies again for those of you who, including myself, actually had a bit of trouble getting in. But it's a very great pleasure to welcome Darius Battiwalla and Andrew Caskey today to talk about the great concert hall organ in Leeds Town Hall. I guess actually with the pandemic and everything, we've possibly forgotten a little bit about what Leeds Town Hall looks like, and I'm sure we're all really keen to go back. But if you, for those of you who are Leeds based, one of the great things about walking into the Victoria Hall is that, of course, you see these mottos that have things like honesty is the best policy and free trade around the place. But the next thing your eye is really drawn to is the magnificent organ. Both the casing, and if you've ever been able to attend the lunchtime recitals on a Monday, the magnificent sound of the organ. So it's a real jewel of Leeds, I think, and as I said, it's a great pleasure to listen to Darius and Andrew talking about the rebuilding of the organ. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who's going to introduce Darius and Andrew.
Thank you, Eric, and welcome to you all. There are still people joining us. We're now up to 65, so that's great. Now, I'm so glad that this is a popular talk. Organs aren't necessarily to the fore in public consciousness, but actually it was on the main news at lunchtime. I don't know whether some of you heard that a vast organ in Katowice in Poland has just been inaugurated on Friday. But I'm not going to steal the thunder of our speaker today by going through its giant stats and commenting on the contrast between concert and church organs. I'm going to leave that to Darius, who grew up in London and started off with the piano at a very young age, then took up the cello, and as it says in his biography, finally took up the organ, as if that were, at a very late stage in life. Can't have been that late, because by the age of 13, he was the organist at St Mary in Islington. His interesting name comes from the fact that, well, his mother's from Lancashire, but his father was from a Parsi family from Bombay. Now, Darius, having spent his childhood in London, came up to Leeds University, was a star student here, and the same when he went over to the Royal Northern College in Manchester and studying piano and organ. And he's taught there for many years, and also at the Royal College of Organists. He was appointed to the position in Leeds as city organist in 2017, only for the pandemic to hit in early 2020. And then, although the town hall was already in restauro at that time in various ways, it completely closed in the autumn of 2021 with a final enormous concert of Mahler 2. Darius is going to explain to us why it is that the town hall and the magnificent organ isn't taking part in this year of culture in Leeds 2023. So now, Darius, if we can go over to you, I'm going to pin your screen, and if you speak now.
Can you hear me?
Yep, that's right. So now I see your screen, and I can pin you, and then you should be able to share your screen.
That's Rachel Unsworth, by the way.
I'm going to mute.
Thank you, Rachel. And also thanks very much for the invitation to speak to the Society and to share the information about what's really a very exciting project for Leeds. I'm going to try and do sort of 2 or 3 things in this talk. And I'm aware that my audience might have sort of different levels of background knowledge and, knowledge about organs in general. So I'm first going to say apologise to the people who don't have that background knowledge, that some of it might be a bit technical, but I'm also going to address myself to people who don't know much about the organ. So I'm going to try and do a few different things at once, and start by asking the question, why do we have an organ in the town hall at all? And why do halls like this have organs like this? It's worth remembering that even before the 19th century, when organs were confined to churches and cathedrals, that if you'd wandered around any town or large village in Europe, the most technologically advanced machine that you would find would have been the organ in the church. They've always been very complex and technological things, even before the Industrial Revolution. But there was this explosion in the 19th century, and the organ became a different kind of thing. It went from being a church instrument to also being a concert instrument. And I think there were sort of three reasons for that, three reasons that particularly chimed with the Victorian sensibility and way of thinking. They were very attached to music, but they were attached to music in a particular way, as a sort of tool of improvement, being concerned for the cultural welfare of people who were flooding into the towns and cities from the countryside. They saw music as part of that whole movement of libraries and mass culture, and the huge choirs that started around then. They needed accompaniment, they needed instruments to support them, and the instruments needed to be loud. So that was the initial impulse behind these huge instruments. They were really there to support mass choral singing. And the reason they could do that was because of the other Victorian preoccupation, which was engineering and technology. They applied the full weight of their technological know-how to these instruments. The instruments had always been quite powerful, but as they had to become even more powerful, the technological advances of the time enabled that to be possible. So, for instance, until the 19th century, organs had always been blown by hand. If you had a small village organ, you'd have taken a small boy with you and paid him some money to pump the organ while you played. Large organs in cathedrals would have had groups of men treading on bellows. Now, of course, the days of electric fan blowing were far in the future at that point. So one ingenious thing, which was pioneered at Leeds, in fact, was to use the mains water pressure as a way of powering the instrument and to produce the huge wind pressures required. But it wasn't just a matter of, producing this amount of air to go into the pipes. You had to have a way of controlling it. And traditionally, the way the organ was played was if you pressed a key, you operated a series of levers, which would open a valve and let air into the pipe. But of course, if the wind pressure gets too high, it becomes too difficult to press the key down and play anything remotely complex. So they devised elaborate systems of pneumatic relays and pneumatic engines to control this. And the things became very complicated, and the dynamic range of the things became much bigger. Now, probably the organ that started all this off was the one in Birmingham Town Hall in the 1840s. It was built for these mass choral singing activities, and of course it had an organ. This was about 20 years before Leeds Town Hall was built. As it was intended primarily to provide a sort of thunderous accompaniment to mass choral singing, it was a bit too cumbersome to play solo repertoire. So to control thousands of pipes in this way, and all the technology, really needed the technology to advance. And there was a rapid advance in the technology and the sophistication of it. And cities competed with each other. This was another Victorian preoccupation, of course, as we know very well in the north of England. Towns competed with each other with the size and the impressiveness of their town halls. Manchester, they went so far as to get an organ from France, as that was considered to be where the best organs were built by some people. So their organ was imported from France. And it was in the early 1850s that the plans for Leeds Town Hall began to take shape. And as we know, the competition was eventually won by Cuthbert Brodrick. Now, I'm hoping now that you can see the first slide. Rachel, can you just reassure me that we can see that?
Yes, that's fine.
Right.
Lovely.
Okay. So the architectural competition was won by Cuthbert Brodrick. And actually, they only decided to include an organ after the town hall had already been started. The way they went about choosing the organ was a bit unusual. They got Henry Smart, who was a leading London organist, and William Spark, who would eventually become the first Leeds City organist, to design an instrument. And then they put it out to tender. and different organ builders were invited to submit anonymous bids to how they could best execute this design. And the design was very advanced. It was a more sophisticated organ than had been built anywhere. Eventually, you can see actually on this one, the next, excuse me. There we are. That's Cuthbert Brodrick's drawing of what he thought the organ should look like. We're not sure if he drew that after the organ was put in or before. It doesn't look exactly like what we had. If you look at the screen in front of the pipes, you can see it's not quite like what we've got now. But that was how Brodrick envisaged the organ to look. The contract was awarded to Gray and Davison. They were a London firm, one of the leading firms, and it was the largest instrument they'd built. It had 93 stops, which means 93 sets of pipes. Roughly speaking, this is a very rough thing, you need to multiply the number of stops by about 50 or 60 to get the number of pipes. So it had about 5,000 or 6,000 pipes, and it had 4 keyboards controlling 6 different divisions. It had lots of technical innovations. I won't go into those now, but they were a result of Henry Smart travelling frequently to London to make technical experiments at Gray and Davison's works in Islington. Some of the technical drawings survive in the Leeds archives from Gray and Davison, these fantastic Victorian technical drawings, which they took such trouble over. Here's one showing some of the pipes enclosed in what we call the swell box. This is the box that encloses the pipes on the solo division, which were pipes that were meant to imitate orchestral instruments. Now, if you're at all familiar with organs, you'll notice 2 quite strange things about this to us. One is that the pipes are all horizontal. They might have done this to save space, or they might have done it to project the sound better. But doing this meant that this division, which was right at the top of the organ, couldn't be seen above the wheel, which is at the top of the organ case. The other thing, which is an example of the sophisticated approach, is that these pipes are in a box, and you can see the shutters on the top, front and center of the box, and those shutters are controlled by a pedal to make the sound louder and softer. But nowadays, most boxes like this just have shutters at the front. To provide 3 different sets of shutters and 2 boxes like this meant that when you pressed the pedal, you'd have to operate 6 different sets of shutters with your foot. And that's just another example of the huge sophistication of this instrument. The great organ, which was the main division of the organ, was divided into front and back, so you could control it, the 2 divisions separately, and one was said to be more French in style, have a more French sound, and the other was said to have a more traditional English sound. The upshot of all this sophistication in organ design was that the organ became a different kind of instrument. It became what they call an orchestral organ. And we need to remember that at the time, orchestral music wasn't really accessible in great quality or quantity outside London. So transcriptions of orchestral music played on these organs, which had an increasing variety of sounds, they could bring the standard orchestral repertoire to a much wider audience at not very great cost, all played by one player. But of course, this new role for the organ, with this huge technical and musical demands on the soloist, had to bring a new breed of highly skilled and well-paid musician, our city or municipal organist, the first one, Dr. William Spark. He was appointed city organist at a salary of £200 a year. Now, that was quite a lot of money, but he had to play 100 solo concerts a year. Here he is, and here his programme for his very opening recital. Now, on this programme, this is from 1865, only the first piece on the programme is actually written for the organ. All the others are transcriptions of orchestral pieces, operatic favourites by Mozart and Rossini. You'll see it ends with the William Tell Overture, which is still a great favourite today, has been played quite often at Leeds Town Hall by Thomas Trotter, one of our leading recitalists now. And just to give you an idea of how successful and celebrated these municipal organists were, the people who came a little bit later than Spark, people like Edwin Lemaire and Alfred Hollins, would earn huge sums of money travelling all over the world. Lemaire was frequently in America, Australia. He was said to be the world's highest paid organist. And when he gave recitals in London, the police sometimes had to be called to control the crowds that would come to his recitals. So quite a far cry from today. But it just shows how much these instruments and players caught the public imagination. Now, as far as we can tell, we don't have any evidence, the organ in Leeds Town Hall from the 1860s was considered successful musically, but technically it had possibly overreached itself. We can deduce that from the fact that the builders frequently had to be called back to make alterations. There were various issues with it, with its reliability. And by the 1890s, it had become a little bit unreliable, but also this was the time when they were establishing a standard pitch across the country, the one that we now know as A equals 440. And the Leeds organ was not at the standard pitch. So the combination of the unreliability and the need to change the pitch led to the organ being completely rebuilt. And this time they didn't go to a London firm, they went to a Leeds firm of Abbott and Smith. There were many changes to the organ, but many things were left the same, but it was simplified. This division of the great organ into front and back was done away with and formed a single enormous division. The horizontal pipes, which we saw earlier in the solo box, that was replaced by a more conventional arrangement, which incidentally meant that the solo box was visible behind the wheel, which you'll see in some later pictures. And they made further changes in the 1900s. Now, they would have reflected the change in fashion in sound that had taken place between 1860 and 1900. The sound of the organ would have become less brilliant and much heavier and more weighty, which was the fashion in Edwardian times. This is a leaflet that Abbott and Smith produced to promote the organ and say what they'd done, explaining, as you can see, that there were a lot of defective pipes. They've brought it up to date as they see it. They haven't seen fit actually to mention the name of the original builders at all, but this was one of their most ambitious designs. The organ, the French style that had influenced the first organ, had rather fallen out of fashion, and this rebuild would have reflected more the German style that was on view in the great Schulze organ at Doncaster Minster. They also replaced the console of the organ, the bit you actually play it from. They made it bigger with 5 manuals instead of 4, and they returned it to a more English style instead of the French one that it originally had. And this is what that looked like. And you can see it has 5 keyboards, which is unusual even now. And you can see buttons under the keyboards, which would have helped the player to change sounds quickly. If you look at a modern console, it would have had a lot more, but at the time, this would have been considered quite a technologically advanced console. So after Spark died in 1897, he was succeeded by the next city organist, Herbert Fricker, who held the post until 1917. But the municipal organ and the city organ that we've talked about was declining in popularity now. The rise of the gramophone meant that you could enjoy orchestral music at home, and there were other competing entertainments such as the cinema. And after Fricker left the post of city organist in 1917, the post wasn't filled, which I think tells you something about the decline in the popularity of organ music, although the organ would have continued to be well used for choral societies and things like that. And through the 20th century, the use of the organ gradually declined, and of course, its very expensive upkeep became neglected. It was cleaned and overhauled and supplied with an electric blower in 1927, but after that, it was pretty much left alone. It wasn't just because of the expense. The whole idea of the Victorian concert hall organ had become unfashionable by the 1920s, of course, alongside the whole aesthetic that went with it. The highly decorated appearance of the organ and the hall itself, they were also victims of that change in fashion. The hall was repainted largely in white, as we can see in this picture from the 1950s. They got rid of the elaborate decorated style altogether. And fashions in organ building had changed as well. The sort of rich sound that was meant to copy orchestral instruments was very out of fashion. Playing orchestral transcriptions became unfashionable, and there was a move towards a leaner and cleaner sound that was thought more appropriate to playing Bach and earlier music. So the organ was left alone and neglected, and many similar instruments in town halls across the country suffered the same fate. They were unfashionable, and the music that was designed to be played on them had also become unfashionable. So in the second half of the 20th century, it gradually became less reliable until eventually, by the early 60s, you could only play the Leeds Town Hall organ if you had a tuner on standby to rectify the faults, which were more and more frequent. By 1968, it was completely unplayable, and it was shuttered up and abandoned altogether. And actually the same fate befell many similar instruments. Middlesbrough and Newcastle, Bradford, They've all got holes where the organ remains a prominent visual feature, but has stood unused for years. And that could have been the end of the road for the Leeds instrument, as it was for many others. And the possibility of replacing it with an electronic instrument was also considered. But thanks to the enlightened attitude of our city council in the early 70s, in 1971, they decided to restore the instrument. And they turned once again to a local firm, this time to Wordsworth and Co., and to the organist of Leeds Parish Church at the time, Donald Hunt, to draw up the specification. It was to be completed in time for the Leeds Festival in 1972, which meant the work had to be completed in 6 months for a budget. I think they spent £38,000 on it, which is about £500,000 in today's money. Wordsworth and Co. did an amazing job, but they were a relatively small firm tasked with an absolutely enormous job. So many different suppliers were used for the pipes, action, console. Many things were bought off the shelf, and they were working 24 hours a day as the deadline approached. Incidentally, when they dismantled the organ in 1971, it was so dirty and full of pollution they had to wear smog masks for the entire operation. So the size of the instrument was heavily reduced at the time. You can see in the picture, actually, it's on your screen at the moment. If you look at the top of the wheel, you can see that solo box which protrudes outwards in rather an unsightly way, which is no longer there. That was one of the things they got rid of. Getting rid of all the orchestral colours and making the organ a different design, what they called a Werkprinzip design, designed after German classical instruments. And they gave it a new division behind the grille at the bottom, which before had no pipes in it at all. With the pipework for that was imported from Holland and was in a very sort of 18th century style, very different to the Victorian style of the original. The console was replaced and put in the centre of the stage. And if you remember the picture of the console from earlier, if you look at this picture of the console taken when it was new in 1972, you can see it has a much more 1960s, 1970s aesthetic. It's all much cleaner, leaner, smaller. The organ was reduced in size from over 100 stops to 81 stops, so still substantial, but really a much different instrument to its predecessor. The opening recital for this organ was given by Floor Peters in 1972, the famous Dutch organist. And here's the programme that he played. Now, I'm showing you this really because it's such a contrast to what was played on the organ in the programme we saw from the 19th century. There's no trace of any orchestral transcriptions here. Only 3 of the pieces in that programme were written after 1750. And 2 of those, as you can see, were written by Floor Peters himself. There's only 1 piece of 19th century music in there, the César Franck, and that was how people thought the future of organ music was going to pan out. They didn't see any need for these rich orchestral colours anymore. And the programme, to some extent, explains the design of the organ. So we're going to look inside the organ now, or inside the organ as it was until it was removed at the end of 2021, to show how the original layout of the organ accommodated, not always successfully, the various changes to it, and have a look at how it's going to change again in the future. Because although the organ is going to have a completely new building frame, the basic layout will remain the same. So looking at the organ case in this picture, which is as it was, and as most of you will remember it, before it became a building site, the lowest level behind the grille, where you can see the statues are, that contained no pipework at all before 1972. It was taken up with wind reservoirs and action. The next level up is the grate with the, actually I've got a pointer here, so I'm going to use that. The grate, you can see, was around here. That's the middle level of the organ, with the pedal divided at the sides, there and there. And the top level, more or less here, contained the enclosed swell. In front of the swell box used to be the unenclosed choir organ, but that was removed in 1972. And on top of the swell box, right up here, was the solo organ, but that was removed, and that was then just empty space, except for one famous stop, the solo ophicleide, the loudest stop on the organ. Now, the first thing that struck you when you went into the case was that some parts of the case were very empty, but other parts were really very crowded. This is what you saw when you went in at the lowest level. As you can see, it's nearly empty, but on the left, you can see, just here, the door which takes you into the small chamber behind the grille, which contains a positive organ. Oh, we missed a bit out here, sorry. The empty space just around here will contain one of the new divisions, the new echo choir division, which will be the quietest part of the organ and contain some really distant and ethereal effects. Most of the pipework for the positive was Dutch, as I said. Some of the 1850s pipework also remained, so it's really a bit of a mixture. Now here's the next level up, which is the most crowded. It's great looking towards the front. You can see the reed stops here, looking out towards the front of the organ here. Incidentally, for the organ enthusiasts, these pipes here at the front of the photograph with the soldered flared ends are a stop called flute à pavillon, which is quite a rarity. It's a gamba stop, a string stop with flared ends, which was a speciality of Gray and Davison. We're not quite sure whether these are the original pipes or if Abbott and Smith restored them, but they left the basic design the same. Now, staying on the same level, this shows a couple of difficulties with the instrument of 1972. And this seems a good point to pay tribute to Andrew Carter, who was the organ tuner and kept it going so well for so many years. You can see on the left how crowded the pedal pipes are. The decision in 1972 to repair the Victorian wind chests rather than provide new ones has left huge access problems. So every time anything went wrong with the pedal, it was very difficult to trace the fault and rectify it as it became increasingly unreliable. And on the right, you can see, again, if you're an organ technical enthusiast, you'll see there's something slightly odd here, which is that these soundboards were originally for much bigger pipes. So when these big pipes that were making quite a rich sound were removed and placed with much smaller ones, they were placed on things that were really the wrong size for them. So there's plenty of scope for rationalizing and saving space. Now moving up to the top level of the organ, we're inside the swell box, and you can see the shutters on the left here, which are opened and closed to let more or less sound out. And this is looking towards the back. This swell box, famously, at the time of its construction, was the biggest one made at the time, and the Gray and Davison, the builders, famously held a dinner inside it. They were so proud of how big it was. We may try and replicate that exercise at some point in the factory. On the left, we have the reeds, the louder reed stops and the high pressure mixture, and on the left, the right hand side, sorry, we've got the quieter flue pipes. This is in front of the swell box. The wheel at the top of the organ is on the left here, and this big empty space here originally had the unenclosed choir organ, and we're going to have a new grand division here. This will have 8 stops as opposed to the 20 stops that were here before 1972, so they won't take up much of the space. But it's a nod to Gray and Davison's idea of a divided grate front and back, and we're going to have a similar thing, but up and down. Above this level, which I never visited very often, which there isn't a photograph of, is the solo ophiclide stop, which lies horizontally and is the loudest stop on the organ. The solo, as I said before, the solo organ was up there, but there's no desire really to return it back up there. The top level of the organ gets very hot, which creates tuning problems, and there are also access problems at that level. So the new solo organ will go behind the grate on the mid-level. This final photograph just shows the state of some of the actual casework, the visible things that you can see, and also some of the things that came to light in the dismantling. You can see from here that actually it's not unlike a piece of stage scenery. It's sort of held together with bits of wood and nails. And on the left here, we can see the angels and the crowns, and you can see various broken bits on the crowns. We had no idea when we started dismantling the organ exactly what some of this stuff was made of, because it was never designed to be removed, and it never had been removed since it was put up in 1855. As it turned out, the angels are made of plaster and can be lifted very easily, but the crowns turned out to be solid iron, and took about 5 people to lift them, and eventually had to be cut away and lifted in sections, and were in fact too heavy initially to be put onto the scaffolding around the organ. So it just shows some of the unexpected things that came to light. So that's it for the history of the organ, really. Incidentally, if you've got any questions, if you type them into the chat, they can be passed on to me at the end. So where did we get to with the organ, and why are we doing what we're doing? It had been apparent for some years that the organ had become so unreliable and difficult to maintain that major replacement and renewal of the action was needed. The more difficult question was that, given the expense and upheaval of doing the work, how much should we take the opportunity to maybe restore some of the colours and bring it back to more like what it was like when it was built. Because some aspects of the instrument as it was till 2021 are very successful. It's got a clear and exciting sound. It can hold its own against a choir and a full orchestra, and it's been a really successful recital instrument. But the changes over the years sort of reflected the swinging pendulum of fashion in organ design, as in everything else. We appointed a consultant initially, an independent organ advisor. These are independent organ building experts who advise churches and cathedrals and concert halls and act as a sort of interface between clients and organ builders. And Ian Bell was our organ advisor, and we invited various different organ builders to come and just tell us what they thought and what they would do with the organ. So the people that came and visited, they all gave us an opinion of what they thought. Eventually, Nicholson's were appointed, Nicholson's of Malvern, as the contractor. They're one of the UK's leading organ builders, and they recently completed one of the largest new instruments to ever be built in the UK, which is the instrument that's now in Auckland Cathedral. And to summarise the conclusions of what Nicholson's thought and what the consultant thought, is that none of the previous incarnations of the instrument had been completely successful. And rather than sort of cobble together something that might lack musical integrity, the best thing was to retain the pipeworks, but for everything else to be new. So we can really have, rather than different bits of the organ working with different mechanisms and different time periods and varying degrees of reliability, the instrument has real integrity as well as mechanical reliability. And one of the most impressive things about Nicholson's approach to the project was their detailed research and respect for the history of the instrument. So the main choruses of the organ will keep their essential style of voicing from the early 20th century, and our new grand division will be similarly voiced. I'll talk about that more in detail. I'm going to show now on the screen the complete specification of the organ for those who understand these things. It won't be up for very long, but you can also access this on the website of Nicholson & Co, the organ builders. And another way in which the history of the organ is going to be really acknowledged and respected is that stops which were moved in 1972 onto different divisions or given different pitches and different names are going to be restored to where they were before. I won't talk about the specification in detail now, but if anybody wants to ask any questions later on, I can definitely answer them. So how's the work progressing? Where are we up to now? Dismantling started in November 2021, as soon as the hall closed. And a major part of that was the huge amount of scaffolding required. This enabled level access to the mid and high points of the organ. Here's the view from up there and out into the hall. And now the case is empty and everything has been taken to the works in Malvern except for the display pipes, which are stored on the floor of the hall. As you can see, they had to be cut in half in order to remove them from the organ. And here's the view from the empty organ case looking out into the hall. And you can see the wooden frames here which supported the pedal towers. Meanwhile, in the factory, work's well underway restoring existing pipes and starting voicing and manufacture of the wind system. Just for those of you who aren't familiar with the interior of organs and how organ pipes work, there are basically two kinds of organ pipes. Although there are many different sounds, there are basically only two kinds. What we call flue stops, which are most of them, which are basically whistles, which can vary from the size of a cigarette up to 10 meters long. And the flue pipes are what you can see here. And then the other kind are reed pipes, which I'll show you a close-up of in a minute. Those are our new 16-foot open bass pipes. Those will provide a really solid foundation to the sound. They're of a very big scale. And you can see in the background, the red painted pipes just over here are our restored wooden pedal trombone pipes. Now, this is a close-up in section of the other kind of pipe, which are the reed pipes. These are more complicated. And the air comes up through the bottom of them. And this brass tongue, which I'm highlighting here, goes on there. And when the wind passes through the pipe, that vibrates against there. So it works like a reed on a clarinet or an oboe. And all the sounds on the organ sound like trumpets or clarinets, or the big reed sounds are made in this way. And one particularly exciting aspect of this project is that a lot of the new pipes are going to be made in Leeds. There are not many specialist pipe makers left. In fact, there are only 2 pipe makers left in the UK. And as it happens, they're both based in Leeds. So the picture you saw earlier, some of those new pipes have been made by Terry Shires, and the new reed pipes are going to be made by Booths. And David Hall, who's the director of Booths, is with us now. So I'm going to hand over to David now, just so he can say a few words about what's involved in making these pipes. There are a few more pictures from his factory here. So Rachel, could we hand over to David at this point?
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yep, that's fine. So I haven't got a pointer, but the picture on the left-hand side, as you can see, one of the chaps, or 2 of the chaps are cutting out what is going to be the new 16-foot bombard, which is the pedal. That is also going down into 32-foot. So the biggest pipes of the 32-foot will be twice as long as the one that you can see on the left-hand picture. The third picture on the top is the existing orchestral bassoon, which is the small pipes on the first to the left with the holes in the top. The second lot of pipes in the middle, they're the new pedal trumpet, which we've made and voiced to replace the existing clarion, I think it was. The picture on the right-hand side then is the new shallots fitted to the existing, it was the existing great trumpet, and the shallots on that were originally a parallel shallot. The bottom picture in the center is the original shallot, which was the parallel ones. But as you can see, we've had a new English style shallot put in, which just gives a bit more rounder tone and a nicer trumpet sound. So that's pretty much what we've done so far with the reeds. There's a number of new reeds to still make, which again is on the basis of what Nicholson's have requested under the direction of James, their tonal director, and we work closely with them to replicate whatever they want and what they've used in the past, and also what, as Darius has said, he wants as the customer. We work closely with them. So hopefully, if there's any questions, we're happy to try and answer them.
How many pipes are you making for us roughly altogether? Have you any idea?
We've about 10 new reeds, each consisting of round about 54 pipes. So in excess of 500 pipes.
Thanks, David. So if you have any questions for David at the end, please put them in the chat. And I'd also like to, it's also great to have Andrew Caskey with us, who's the managing director of Nicholson & Co. So he's sort of in charge of the project, really. So Andrew, are you there as well? And it would just be good to hear from you what the project is sort of means for the company, really, I guess, and your vision for the future of the Leeds instrument.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I should also apologise. I have to disappear in about 15 minutes to go to choir practice to play for Evensong. But it's lovely to be here, and I'm learning lots about the project so far. This is a great privilege. People talk about once-in-a-lifetime projects, and this is very much one of these. It's very rare that any organ builder has the chance to really start effectively from a blank sheet of paper in designing a new concert organ. As Darius has mentioned, all the mechanism is going to be new. Approximately 60% of the pipework of the new organ is reused, a retained pipework from the old organ, and about 40% is new. But that's really been because we started with a blank sheet of paper really to decide what's the best kind of concert organ that we think would fulfill the musical needs of the hall. All of our team are engaged on the project. It's actually quite ironic at the moment we have 2 town hall organs in our workshop, because we are also doing a restoration of the organ of Manchester Town Hall. I'm sorry to mention Manchester in a talk about Leeds, but it's really stimulating for our team because they are extremely different projects. Leeds is effectively building an enormous new organ, whereas Manchester is a very strict reconstruction of a former phase of that instrument. And so both of them are very stimulating to the team. At the moment in the workshop, for Leeds, we are working on the big soundboards. That's what most of the big wooden units that most of the pipes sit on. And we're also working on the chests, which some of the pipes, particularly in the pedal section, sit on. The 3 expression boxes that some of the divisions sit in have been largely made. And there is a team turning lots and lots of poplar timber into the building frame. That's the whole skeleton structure, as it were, that holds the organ up. Also, keyboards for the console have been made. And in addition to the new pipework being made by our colleagues in Shires and in booths in Leeds, we're also making quite a number of new stops ourselves in the workshop. And so it's a real collaboration and a team effort.
Thanks, Andrew. And I should also say that if you look on Nicholson & Co website, that they have loads of photographs of what they're doing to the organ at the moment. They're great at posting stuff, so you can see really an account of the whole process as it's going so far.
Yes, if you want to find that, just search for our company name. But then once you're on the website, go to projects, current projects, and then you will see Leeds there.
Thanks, Andrew. So there's a couple of other things that I'll briefly talk about. Now, there is another completely different aspect of this project, which is to do with the appearance of the organ. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The reason I'm going to talk about that separately at the end is because I'm also going to talk about finance and the decorative appearance aspects of the project. We've been lucky enough to get a Heritage Lottery Fund grant for. However, the main project, people often ask how it's being paid for. So I'm just going to clarify that. And it ties up with what Rachel said right at the beginning, which is the town hall being closed at the moment. The works that are going on in the town hall at the moment mostly don't involve the inside of the Victoria Hall at all. Most of them are to do with all the areas, the foyers, and exciting things to do with making all the stuff that you see when you come into the building first, restoring original decorations, new cafes, new bits and pieces there, making the whole building more accessible and more welcoming. And we thought that the town hall being closed for 2 years was an opportunity to do the organ, which definitely also needed doing. Otherwise, we might have had to close the hall further or cause huge inconvenience just to do the organ. Having made that case to the council agreed to take out a loan to finance the work to the organ. So a loan has been taken out and a trust has been set up to raise the money to pay the money back. But we do need to pay the money back. The council have set up the Brodrick Trust. They set up an independent trust because an independent trust is better placed to apply for grants from some funding bodies than a local government doing it directly. And this is how you can support the project. I hope that you've had an idea of the sheer complexity of the thing, why this is such a costly thing to do, over £1.5 million of work on the organ. And the money will have to come eventually, if we don't pay the money back through raising it through the trust, will have to come out of future concert budgets and cultural budgets, which obviously we don't want to happen. So please do visit the Brodrick Trust website or the Town Hall website and find out how you can help. There are various things you can do, including adopting pipes or make direct donations or become a sponsor or support the scheme in those ways. So if you could spread the word about that, that would make a huge difference to us and help the project along. Now, going back,
if I may just contribute,
sure,
Darius,
yeah,
just to say that I think it's worth paying tribute to the council in Leeds for having the courage, you might say, in Minister parlance, to go and support a project like this. Darius mentioned earlier on how many town hall organs have fallen silent in the past, and many are in poor condition. And when the project at Leeds was announced, there was universal astonishment amongst musicians around the country that any local authority had had the vision to do that. And I think that that is so that is worth recording. And also I think it's testament to the very hard work that Darius and before him Simon had done to really place music making on the organ at the centre of the artistic life of the hall. And we very much hope that that will continue to be the case.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think I'd thanks to Simon, we have one of the most successful lunchtime organ series in the country. It's great to see you here today as well, Simon. But and I've felt very lucky to have taken that over, something that was really such a successful thing. And I sometimes also think that, not being from Leeds myself, that people who live in Leeds might not always realise how lucky they are to have a council that supports the music so well, because council music departments are a rarity these days. And to provide free organ concerts, chamber concerts, brass band concerts is a fantastic thing. And we've always been lucky to have councillors that have been interested in supporting the music. So I'll move on to talking about the way the organ looks now, because the earliest pictures of the hall show the organ and the apse behind it were stenciled more elaborately than today. The original decorative scheme of the hall was replaced in the 1890s. This picture dates from around then. We're never quite sure with these pictures exactly when they are, but we think this is from the 1890s. And in 1930, as we saw earlier, the hall was redecorated in a plain scheme reflecting the sort of reversion to that Victorian aesthetic. The organ wasn't painted white, but it was painted in pastel colours, sort of Art Deco. Not very attractive to our eyes now, but I think they thought it was an improvement on the Victorian scheme. After some structural damage in the late 70s, the earlier decorative scheme was restored in the main hall. The original scheme couldn't be found, so they used John Crace, the decorator's drawings, which are at the Victoria and Albert Museum. These are the drawings they used on which to base the restoration in 1979. But there were no drawings of the organ. So the organ was done, we think, by extrapolation from this scheme of the main hall. This is what it looked like just after it was restored in 1979. And that might be a surprise to those of you who saw it more recently, because it's actually faded quite a lot since 1979, especially the columns, as you can see. Now, although we haven't been able to find any colour pictures or designs for the organ from before 1930, the detail on the black and white photos is enough to show that there was actually quite an elaborate scheme, much more elaborate than what you can see in this picture. But there's a close-up of the pipes in 1890. So if we wanted to restore that, we had to find out what was actually going on in this picture. And we went to a firm in London who were responsible for restoring the pipes in York Minster. If you have seen the organ in York Minster after restoration, you'll see it's been fantastically restored visually as well as musically, with the Victorian stenciling design recreated and looking absolutely brilliantly new. So we commissioned this firm to examine one of the pipes to try and uncover the earlier scheme, sort of paint archaeology. And we've got photographs that show the later paint scraped off to reveal the original stencil design. So if you look, the grey areas that you can see on the right-hand picture are bare metal and would actually eventually be ivory or white. But if you can compare this with the black and white picture, you can see the position on the instrument. So this diamond shaped here, which I'm pointing to on the left, corresponds to this red area on the right. And you can extrapolate from that other details, for instance, the sort of fleur-de-lis looking design corresponding up here. And here, this detail on the right is one of these spots that I'm highlighting on the left here. This sort of flower design, possibly a Yorkshire rose, and you can see the positioning on the instrument there. So to recreate those designs, new stencils are going to be made individually for each pipe. And the other thing that's going to be restored, which actually Nicholson's are doing, is you can see the fretwork here between the feet of the pipes. And if you can remember, I'm not sure I can remember this, but the hall as it is now, the fretwork here is still existing, but the one down here has been lost. So that's also going to be remade and recreated by Nicholson's. So I hope that's given you an overview of the project. That's really, I think, that's all. I can see there's a few questions come up, but I'll just hand back to Rachel and Eric to see if there's any specific questions you want to pass on.
Darius, can I just thank you for a fantastic talk, both in the detail and the concept. It's really, really great. And you're clearly on a really interesting project here. And can't wait to hear the new organ. Now, I think everybody can now unmute themselves, and you can either ask a question and put your hand up if you know that's the reactions tab at the bottom, or you can write it in the chat. And I think the chat has been a chat, because I think that Andrew sorry, also could I thank Andrew as well. Andrew, are you actually in Edinburgh there?
No, I'm based in, I live in Worcester, and I'm actually at my in-laws' house in Melbourne at the moment.
Right, okay. Well, thank you very much also for taking the time and giving us these important details. So thank you for that. And also David Hall, if he's still here, thank you too. So I think that some of you have actually been chatting through this chat already. But I think maybe a new piece of chat that was what does voiced mean? Somebody asked that question, and also maybe Darius, you comment on John Riley's question first, perhaps, about the acoustics in the hall, because they've come in for
Yes.
a lot of discussion, shall we say, criticism over years.
Well, I think the first thing to say about the acoustics in the hall and the sound of the organ is that the design of the hall does not help clarity of sound, and I think we need to distinguish probably between clarity of sound and resonance, because you can have a building that echoes for 5 seconds but is quite clear, but you can have a building that only echoes for 1 second and is quite muddy and unclear. And I think one of the things that we are stuck with at Leeds is the barrel vault, which is not how a concert hall would be designed nowadays, and that doesn't help the clarity of sound. As far as the changes go, orchestral music needs usually a slightly less resonant sound than organ music, and one of the things that orchestras suffered from is a lack of reflective surfaces near to the instrument, because that's really what affects clarity. It's not how reflective the surfaces are, it's how near they are to the instruments. And that was the reason for introducing the canopy over the orchestra, and combining that with introducing the curtains over the half moon windows and at the back to have more resonant surfaces near the players and fewer further away from the players. Now, one of the things that's been done recently in the last sort of 3 or 4 years, just before lockdown, I think, is those curtains over the half moon windows at the sides, I know behind the gallery at the back, are now electrically operated and can easily be opened and shut. So that means we can actually slightly adjust the acoustics. So for instance, we could theoretically have those open for organ recitals, so we have a little bit more reflecting surfaces, and have them closed for other kinds of concerts. So that's quite a welcome development.
Good. So I mean, there was also a lot of debate some years ago. I think that Sir Mark Elder, I think, even sort of stimulated it in a speech after the piano competition once, about having a new concert hall in Leeds. Is that, I guess, has this extensive renovation of the Leeds Town Hall sort of put that to bed?
Well, I mean, I think that's I'm probably not the person to ask that question, but that you'd have to. I think. I mean, I like the hall as it is. I think you could say, maybe I would say that, but I think it has a real sense of occasion. I think everybody feels that when they go to a concert there. When you go in here, especially go in here, say Gerontius or Elijah in there, you really feel that you're in the kind of space it would have been written for. And it really does have that sense of occasion. And I think with the improvements that they've made to the acoustic, it really is better. And I think the other danger which isn't always avoided, though has been avoided in Birmingham, is if you've got a Victorian town hall like Leeds and then you build a new hall, what do you do with the old one?
Yeah.
You know, these you have to be careful about these things, I think. And I think with the improvements they're making to the hall in general to make it a more welcoming place, I think it's a real asset to the city. I've just briefly also just addressed the question of the voicing thing.
Yeah.
Because I didn't quite realise this myself until recently, but when the pipes arrive from the pipe makers at the voicers, at the organ builders, they barely make a sound at all, you know, and the sound they make is not recognisable as musical at all. So a lot of things have to be done to the pipes to make them speak musically, and for every pipe in the set to sound the same. And if you're interested, and it is interesting, James, who's the head voicer at Nicholson's, has there are videos of him on YouTube just taking you through the process of voicing just a single pipe and all the things he has to do to turn it from a fairly inert piece of metal into a real musical thing, and it's quite fascinating to watch. And then if you imagine that process replicated sort of 5,000 times over, that gives you some idea of the scale of what's going on.
Yeah.
One of the things that James and all of us at the firm have tried to do is, in coming up with this scheme, in other words, the stop list for the organ, is to try to make it future-proof. We look back at the work done by Abbott and Smith and by Wood Wordsworth and say, oh, it's very Edwardian or it's very 1970s. And perhaps in the 2050s, people will look back and say, oh, it was terribly 2020s that. But we hope not. We hope that it's more versatile and that it will be longer lasting, and that it is not the gist of the scheme is not an extreme swing of the pendulum as has happened in the past. Someone's just asked the question, what's been done to future-proof the organ to try to facilitate repairs and avoid expensive renovations in future? And really the answer to that question is that's why we are replacing all of the mechanism with new, because it is partly, I say for two reasons. First of all, it greatly simplifies the mechanism. There are far fewer moving parts and they are of a consistency, so there will be much less to go wrong. But secondly, the materials that are used in modern organ building, particularly laminate timber, is much more impervious to, or much more resistant, I should say, to ravages of temperature and humidity. One of the problems that the old organ faced was that the soundboards, which dated from the 1850s, very long pieces of grained timber. And you can imagine just how often the heating in the hall had gone on and off and on and off. And every season of the year, the wood had moved and big splits develop. Now with laminate timber, that doesn't happen. And so the organ should be far more resistant to being damaged by extremes of humidity and temperature, as well as being much simpler mechanically.
Yeah, and because as Andrew says, there are bits of the organ from 1850, but there are also things that they did in the early 1970s, and we all know this not just from organ building, that we wouldn't necessarily do now. In the 1970s bits, there's more chipboard used than we'd be entirely comfortable with now, and there were also some technical innovations from the 70s which have turned out to be not as good as the things they replaced in terms of using plastic instead of leather and things like that, whereas now we would probably use leather again. So we've, as Andrew said, we've avoided that mixture of different technologies from different eras sort of colliding with each other in a not very comfortable way.
Thank you. So I think questions being asked and answered on the chat there. Would anybody like to ask a question in person? Darius, are you thinking that there's works that could be performed with the renovated organ that have been, difficult or
yes, I think
satisfactory?
I think there's, because although players have played, the sort of orchestral transcriptions and arrangements that are now coming back into fashion, they've been a bit of a compromise, and you can't always find, you have to sort of struggle and be very inventive to find the right sound, or you end up using the same sounds too often. I think one of the things people will notice with the new organ, because it has so many different sounds, is that you'll find that every player makes it sound totally different, because there will be so many ways to so many combinations and different sounds. It'll take quite a lot of the different. There'll be so many more possibilities that those, and it will be. I mean, it will probably be quieter and louder at the extremes, but the point about it being louder is not to make more noise. It's so that when you're playing with an orchestra, you don't have to drive it absolutely flat out all the time, so you can have different kinds of very loud sounds instead of having to pile on every single stop. So it will just be much more versatile. Andrew, thanks so much. Sorry to see you go, but thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I'd hoped that having it at 4 o'clock as a starting time would mean that organists would still be available. And I'm sorry we had a late start. So I just wanted to, thinking of how magnificent it's going to be and how interesting the sound will be, maybe when we have the opening concerts, Darius, so there'll be have to be special crowd control, like in.
Nice.
Would you mentioned about the other works going on? I just thought maybe I'd share a picture of the magnificent new windows. Can you see that?
Yes.
So I took that one midday. Actually, they were just desperately rushing to get all the scaffolding off before His Majesty came to Leeds before Christmas, and just happened to catch it. So I gather it's a sort of £1 million worth of new windows. They've been poorly replaced in the middle of the 20th century. They weren't double glazed. They've been covered in that bird netting, anti-bird netting, and so couldn't even be cleaned. And so this is all part of them. So that's why it had to be completely wrapped, by the way, Christo style. Anyway, I'll stop that now and go back to the organ. But I just happen to have that to hand.
Thanks, Rachel. There is somebody at iPhone who's got their hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Are you there? No. It seems...
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? No.
Gosh, you explained it all so clearly, Darius, and David and Andrew, between you. It's just fantastic. It really was very, very clear, and so much packed into a relatively short time. Fantastic.
Yes, indeed. Right.
Again, thanks for the invitation, and thanks to everyone for listening. And I should say, by the way, I'm sure most of you know, but just for those of you that don't, that the organ recitals, the Monday lunchtime ones, are carrying on at Leeds Cathedral. In fact, I'm giving the one tomorrow lunchtime at 1:15. So we are carrying on with the organ. So please support us there, and please support the project if you can as well.
And in case people don't realise, Leeds Cathedral, it means St Anne's. Just round the corner from the town hall in
Cookery Street,
yeah. So it's really not a very different location. Okay.
Right. Any final comments? Anybody? Rachel?
Well, just thank you so much for coming together for this. And I'm really sorry about the slow start, and I'm sorry we probably, cheesed off a number of folk who gave up trying to get in. But anyway, this will be on the website. I'm going to stop